type in your questions into the chat, and then that way you don't forget the really cool question you were going to ask Matt at the end. Okay, Matt Reiner, take it away.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I hope your lunches were good and that Baby Yoda is amazing. I don't have anything to present as good as that today, but we are going to be talking a little bit about baking, at least an analogous baking situation, where we talk about combining what a lot of our teams have in documentation and then the UI and the content that lives in there and sort of blending those together into one really great user experience that is sort of unlike anything that maybe you've made before. So I am Matt Reiner. Among other things, I am a documentarian, so I do some of our tech writing at K15T. I write some marketing content. I kind of write just about everything that you can imagine. And it's my job specifically to connect with the users of our apps, get their ideas, show them to our team and see how we can sort of connect the two. And I really like this job because I used to be a user of our apps. So kind of, got to create my own job in the company and I really enjoy that. So yeah, super nerd about tech writing. But speaking of super nerds, the whole company at K15T, we're kind of all pretty nerdy about content. And it's kind of important to know a little bit about us to know sort of why we did what we did here. So we make apps for Confluence. I'm not sure, I would guess a lot of your companies are using Confluence often internally, but we created apps that help you do content management in Confluence and be able to even use it as a tech writing tool. That's what I used to do with our apps as a user. So we build apps specifically to make it so teams can get going quickly. That's a really big focus of ours. And also we build them so they work together. So kind of like Microsoft Office, the idea is you can use multiple apps to sort of customize Confluence to do just what you want it to do. And while our apps really have become very powerful, unfortunately, that simplification, that onboarding experience has been a bit rough in some places. And this has led to a lot of questions from our users, a lot of blockers for them. So even though a feature might exist to solve their problem, they just can't find it because the information they need is just not available. And there have just been some straight up messes where eventually, we help them sort of or change the way they're using our apps because we didn't really guide them in the right way. And you might be thinking, like I used to, oh, but we have a help center. They should just be going to the help center. That has all the information they need. They have all the docs they need to figure out their problem. But the truth is, no matter the effort that we put into our help center, making it accessible, making it searchable, making it beautiful, making it mobile optimized, whatever, it is really this other thing over there that maybe people know about, maybe they don't know about, but they're not looking at it. They're probably not thinking about it. The information that's over there is over there. And so the next conclusion might be, oh, well, the content in our UI, that's probably enough, right? Well, the truth is the UI is secondary to them as well. See, users don't really care about your app. They're not using your app generally for the pleasure of it, unless, your product that your team makes is like a game, I guess. But generally, they care about something else, users do. And so the UI and the experience there is just a means to a much more personal end. And so the real question is, how can we bring the information into that experience so they can really just kind of move through quickly, efficiently, and hopefully enjoyably to do the thing they actually care about? And so we had this question as a team. How can we sort of transform this experience so that users aren't getting stuck? They can move through and do the thing they really care about. So I did the thing that all souls do when they're in search of answers. I went to Google and I searched for a solution to how can we build a great experience here. And, of course, I found something. So we found this great talk by Dan Stevens. At the time he was working at Atlassian. He gave this talk at Write the Docs Portland in 2016. Totally incredible talk, totally like changed the way I think about content and information. But he describes how he worked at Atlassian to bring marketing, UI, and documentation writing all together to create what Atlassian calls information experiences. It was so successful in bringing new users in onboarding existing users, et cetera, that they've actually since moved on and created an entire group within the company. They've moved all their tech writers into the design group. They've really just formed a whole new area of the organization around this idea of building information experiences. It's a must watch. I digress, but I thought this was perfect. And I searched a little bit more from him, and he has this great quote where he says, humans will be more readable or more readily accept and adopt things which they can place in the context of a story. The more coherent the narrative, the more pleasing the experience. And I just thought this is perfect. We knew that we needed to build that kind of like story-driven experience. And so we came up with a recipe for how to bring our different currently separate pieces of information together into one really great information experience. So it really matters that we do this, that we bring our information together. So today we'll talk a bit about why that is, because the why really matters, especially if we're going to justify this in our organizations. Then we'll talk about sort of what we need to get in place to be able to even think about, reconfiguring the content that we have. We'll talk about how to work with designers to understand customer journeys or user journeys and map out the content that we need to put in different places. We'll talk about aligning our documentation with user flows, how to structure our content for reuse in these different ways, and then tips for connecting your docs that you have to your app directly. Then we'll talk a little bit about why we need to put a special focus on things like voice and tone, saying just enough and nothing more, and avoiding assumptions, because those things become even more important when we create these experiences. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how and why we need to align with marketing to expand these information experiences even further, because to our users, information is fluid. So I'm going to pull up that recipe that we came up with. And there are lots of different things that your team can do here. This was just what worked well for us. So keep that in mind. I'll be saying this is what we did, but everyone's probably going to have a different variant. Some of us like to measure very exactly, and some of us like to just, eyeball it, right? So, sorry. Boop, boop, boop. So, okay, well, just like with every recipe online, unfortunately, I can't just jump right into the recipe, right? You might have your sleeves rolled up, you're ready to make something. That's typically our nature. But we really do need to talk about the why, because the why really matters. And we have to be able to justify expending energy and company time and resources on a project to build information experiences. We're not just going to be able to do that without asking. So here is why this really matters. First of all, this matters a lot to our users. It's important to put useful information in just the right place for them, whether it's in our app UI, whether it's our docs, whether it's a blend of those things. And that's based on a concept called progressive disclosure. That's a design concept. Jacob Nielsen, a design expert, says progressive disclosure is a technique that defers advanced and rarely used features to secondary screens, making the application easier to learn and less error prone. So essentially, what you do with progressive disclosure, the whole idea behind it, is you take the complicated stuff, the options, the features, and you shove those to a later point in the user's journey. So when they maybe enter a wizard, for example. The first step has the simplest controls, the things that most people want to do, and they can successfully use those controls, right? And then maybe more complicated controls are in the next one, or more complicated information. And what that does is that builds users' confidence, because they can see, oh, I know enough, or I'm learning enough along the way to be successful. Maybe I can do the next thing. And it also helps users do the most simple things quickly, because there's a certain percentage of people who just need to do those simple things. And information is the same way. It's the same principle here. And so we need to be able to walk people through those journeys through a connection of all of the different types of content that we have. And frankly, some teams have said, well, we don't need documentation, we have UI, right? We don't need to focus too much on the content, because if we have good UI, that will solve the problem. And frankly, there is an important part of things, having good UI, but we have to have proper content to really guide people through experiences. Otherwise, we will make the mistake of making assumptions, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So not only does this benefit our users, it actually benefits, excuse me, our team itself. So when we put a focus on content and building journeys for users, it really starts to help show our team the value of content creation and documentation and design, which often teams struggle, seeing the value of that. It also helps our teams to begin to cross-train, because UI experts are really good at maybe writing certain kinds of content or crafting certain experiences. We as tech writers and documentarians, we're good at maybe a different type of writing, different type of focus. Our engineers might be really good at helping explain more complex parts of an interaction. I'm always surprised when I get writing from engineers. Sometimes, sometimes it's a positive surprise, sometimes not, but it helps the whole team see how the content we create, no matter where it lives, really impacts the way our users move through this thing that we're making. Also, as a sort of secondary benefit, when we put a focus on content, content also gets a really big boost among our team, because then we can't ship until the content is done, right? The documentation needs to be in place, the UI text needs to be in place, and that connection between the two with an in-app help integration. So it helps us as tech writers to not have those situations where they're like, we just shipped, whether you had the documentation ready or not, right? So that, I think that helps put content where it belongs, which is, a much higher priority for people. So not only does it help our users and our team, but it really helps the organizations that we work for. They're really trying to retain users, and having a better experience generally builds customer love for an app. And when you have users who really like your app, your app starts to sell itself, right? You don't have to pay the high costs that losing users typically entail. It also really greatly improves the customer support experience. Not only can you help reduce just the company needing to hire a bunch of support professionals, which is an exponentially growing need as you have more users. If you don't improve your experience, you will also need to have more support people. So you can eliminate that need, or at least reduce it. But also it makes it easier for support professionals to actually solve the problem, because they can say, oh, you want to do this, go here, and that experience will teach you the rest of the way. They don't have to keep rewriting documentation. Your UI and your documentation work together to guide users in that way. And this all just works together to boost product value, both in the eyes of users and in the eyes of the company, and maybe even in the eyes of investors. So I'm all done talking about business stuff, but this really matters. This is very important. If you're looking to build a business case around this, I gave a talk at Write the Docs a few years ago about that very thing. But enough about this. Let's make something. Let's see what we need to put together. Oh my gosh, those stories are so long at the end of recipes. Let's make something. Okay, so first up, we need to get a few things together to be able to start assembling our information experiences. So first, don't be intimidated by the size of your app. You might already be thinking, our app is way too big. Our product is way too massive for me to even think about creating something like this. Or like, we just have too many documents. There's just too much documentation. There's no way we could like really just tie it all together really well. Like, don't panic. Focus on something small. This is how our teams have been successful with this. And I would guess it's going to be the same for you. Focus on something like maybe a new feature. Maybe a new feature is coming out. And so you can say, okay, how can we craft a really great experience here? I'm going to work with my designers, work with my team to do this. Or find those areas where you feel like you have the best documentation already. You got some great info, and see how you can kind of bring some of that info into the UI and link back to documentation, that sort of thing. Or maybe there's an area where your designers are working on redesigning the product. And that's another great place to say, okay, what are you changing? What can I update in the documentation, et cetera? We actually did a bit of each. So we were redesigning some areas for a new group of users where we were trying to cater to. So doing a redesign and then also adding some new features. So that was a really great place to be like, okay, let's evaluate the content that's used here as well. Also connect with your team. Don't just start jumping in and making changes like really quickly. That is a lesson for making enemies. You want to learn who does what on the team and who has done what. Don't ever disrespect the content that lives on a screen somewhere or that's been written in documentation, because chances are either you wrote it or a teammate you're working with did, and there's a million reasons why they didn't have the time to do it maybe the best way, or we've learned things since then. So instead, focus on working with your team, getting to know them, see what they are interested in doing. So in my case, the team, because they were already focused on redesigning things and adding new features, they were very open to me, jumping in and adding to this process. And then once you focus on a certain area of the app, dig through it. For us, there were a few wizards that we were really focused on redesigning. And I went through and just made, excuse me, a massive list of screenshots and questions that I would ask myself, like, okay, I'm in this wizard. What are all the error states that could possibly happen here? Because all of those have text. Or how many variants of this process could there possibly be? I had to poke some engineers to see what all can go wrong. What will people read? Work with your whole team on this. It can be messy. We had a lot of back and forth. We ended up talking about design changes, UI changes, and everything in this huge table, which we used Confluence for because that helped us all like stay sane. But we looked at screens, UI text, and the existing links to our documentation that were in place at the time. So now that we sort of know what we're working with as we're getting started here, let's look at sort of making our start into this. Where do we get going? So first, we'll start by understanding who our users are and where they're going. So we need to speak to our designers. Our designers are familiar with the journeys that our users need to take. Not just click paths. We all are kind of familiar with sort of what you can do features-wise often, but really, what is the user's intention? Designers often have their finger on that kind of pulse. And they know what exists today. Often they'll share something like this. This is called a user flow diagram. And some might be fairly simple like this, sort of showing what's the intention, how do users move through it. But they can also be very complex depending on your system. And these are really valuable to us because we can move through this path and try to clear our minds and think like tech writers and say, what questions come up here? Like if I make this choice and then I hit this area, what does this mean? This is asking me if I want this. What is this? Are we properly describing this? Are we saying too much about this and overwhelming users? We get to move through these processes as if we've never seen them before, which is really cool, a cool time to think like a user. And by the way, if you don't have a designer, who has made these, you can make one. They're pretty simple to make. It's just sort of a way of thinking about moving through your app experiences. I would recommend creating a map. That's what I called it. It's that huge table that I mentioned. And this is a really great way to document your journey through there. So it might be you have a block for every app screen, or maybe every field on every screen, depending on how detailed you need to get, how much focus you're putting there, and decide where is UI text needed? Where is there too much UI text? Where do you need to add more documentation? Where do you have too much documentation? What about links to the documentation, or should we bring some documentation in? There's just a lot of considerations. Create a map for yourself. Just write all your thoughts down, what you found in this big ugly table. You will thank yourselves later. So we use this massive thing. We documented each link in the UI that existed, whether there was field level help for each of the fields. And then we would distinguish what in-app help was currently in place and then what needed to be added. I'll talk a little bit more about this more, but this kind of looks like the ramblings of a lunatic, but it all made sense to us. And you will know how to read your own map, hopefully. So the next thing is to speak with your designer to see like what actually needs to be said throughout the user's experience. They will have a vision for things, and then they'll also kind of know what exists today. They'll tell you what is good, what they think is great, and they'll tell you what they think needs to be changed. And you get to figure out sort of where the UI actually should be changed instead of content. Probably your designer will have a good idea, but just like with documentation, there is no amount of information experience you can try to like cobble together to fix a bad UI. So be honest there as well. Don't waste your time. Focus particularly, I would say, on interactive wizards or situations where there's lots of drop-down menus or hidden items. Those are places where users need lots of guidance. They often end up in support for situations like that, and try to get the content around those as solid as possible. In our case, our UI text within our wizards was pretty good, but there were a lot of changes needed because we were writing for a new audience. And then also our links out to our documentation were they were a mixed bag. So we made a good start here. We kind of know we've got some pieces put together. Let's look at how we can restructure our content to work across the user's journey. And this is where it starts to get pretty fun. So first, let's take what we know and align our documentation with what we know our users are doing now. So we've looked at the user flow, so we understand their true intentions and sort of how they enter into different parts of our product. And we know what the designer sort of is intending. And we've created that big content map so we know what's there and what needs to be there. So we can first start by looking at our existing documentation or the section of documentation and revising that. Maybe grouping and reordering content based on what's most interesting or useful for users. Maybe we rename pages to align with the questions that users actually have in those experiences. Maybe we just make sure that users can go to any one of those pages halfway down the page, right, to some subheading, and be able to just start learning. Because remember, we're gonna create experiences where they can just jump right into exactly what they need. They need to not be missing content that was above that they should have read. Kind of every page is page one approach. So we actually completely changed the structure of our documentation and the order of our docs. Sorry, this picture isn't great. This is an after picture. I forgot to take a before picture. But the idea was to focus on what our users actually were doing and not group it around features per se. It was a pretty big change, but it matches up much better with their user flows. So the next thing is to create reusable pieces of content. You may already be using some content reuse in your documentation, but what's really important here is you need to start to think about, okay, we're going to reuse content in new ways, not just in the documentation, but we're going to create some new experiences where we need content chunks. So important content chunks to have, I think, are short descriptions for pages. Those are really, really great. And with most tools, those are pretty easy to create. And then we found that it was really great to take those first 1 to 2 paragraphs, typically at the top of like a concept topic where you're introducing something. It's very high level. Those were really, really useful for taking those introductions, and actually I'll show you how we brought those into our UI, because often people just need that intro to something to get going with it. So break out those intros and make sure they can stand on their own. You could read those and they're complete thoughts. Our concept topics were really well written, I thought, but they did need to be broken out and kind of restructured a bit to support this approach. And now we're actually going to make that fun connection, the really exciting part, because we've laid everything out. So we broke things into those reusable chunks. And then we used the design technique that we stole from Apple. They used to call it peek and pop, which was if you pressed and held something in iOS for a little bit, just held it lightly, you would get a little bit of information. And then if you pressed a little, that was called the peek, they called that. And then if you pressed a little harder, that was the pop. You get a bigger screen with more info. And then if you press even harder, you break the screen, and then you have to have it repaired. But it was a really interesting look into progressive disclosure, how they were giving you more info the harder you pressed. So we kind of borrowed that, which sadly Apple has abandoned that because ironically they didn't explain to users well enough how to use it. But we wanted to use that sort of technique with our UI. So here's how we did it. This is just an example using the tools we have. You'd have to figure out how to do it with yours. So we use Confluence for our documentation. And what we did was we took all those introduction chunks of content that I mentioned, and each one of them lives in a page. So we have a page for why do I need a prefix, creating a new document, etc. So those are all the intro chunks. And we made sure that tone really matched well with what we have in our UI text. So then, and here's an example of one of those pages. It's just the intro. So now we wanted to first bring that content into our documentation. So we used, in Confluence, you use include macros. That's their content reuse tool as part of Confluence. So brought that content right into our documentation, which is awesome. And then it just looks natural on our help site. That's just the intro that feels like it should be there. And then also when users are using our app, so this is one of our apps here, if they click the help link, it doesn't take them over to our documentation. Instead, we've built this like in-app introduction experience here. So this would be like the peek, right, that Apple used. So they can open up this dialogue, and here is intro content. Unfortunately, this is not the same content. This is a bad screenshot here, but this introduces them to this feature that they're working with here. And then if they're like, okay, but this is not enough information for me, then they can click this link to pop, and they pop over to the full documentation page where they can continue to learn about the feature and get into tasks and things like that. So that was sort of how we implemented things here. Your team might do it differently, but this was really, really exciting. But it also got me thinking about, okay, so we've architected the content well, and we've connected it up to our help center all magically and cool. But quick distraction here. There will be lots of people that you encounter while trying to build these that are doubtful about the value to companies. Just so you know, stay calm. Remember why this matters, because it really, really matters for our users, and be confident that you are a content professional and you know what's best for users. When you are successful and you deliver something great, you will know it. Okay, back to the recipe. So let's talk about how we need to write, because just because we have the content connected doesn't mean the content will make sense for our users. So first of all, voice and tone all of a sudden becomes so much more important here. And here's an example why. If you have a task topic about importing data into your app, maybe when you wrote the task topic, you were very light and you were having fun with it, and it has kind of a fun tone, which is great. But maybe your user is in your UI and they just had the situation where they lost data, and they got an error, sorry, we lost your data. Click here to go learn how to re-import your data. And then they jump over to your documentation, and they're reading this really happy, like, oh, you're importing content thing. That's just sort of like an empathetic slap to the face. So it's important that you keep an eye on tone, because voice tends to say the same, but tone, we really need to make sure that we recognize all the places where users could be coming from and that we're writing appropriately to that. That sounds scary. We haven't had too many bad experiences there, but be wary. Hopefully a lot of work has gone into the UI of your app. Speak with your designer about what work they've done, where they've really focused on what matters to them as far as content that's been written, and then do an audit yourself. Go through and see what is being said here. Where is there too much being said? I have this book. It's a little dusty. It's a great book. I just been distracted. It's called Great Demo, and they talk about how many product demos and introductions to a product are killed when you over explain something, and users start to feel like, oh my gosh, this is too complicated for me. It's too advanced. I was looking for something simple. Go through the UI and see where does text need to be simplified and removed or rephrased, or don't tell them all the things they can do. Just tell them the most common things that need to be done. You will come across some situations where content needs to be added, but very much of the time, you really need to rethink what's there to see, is this truly helpful for users, or did we put it somewhere because, we were, I don't know, worried. We were trying to cover our butts in one way or another. That said, avoid assumptions. So there is no way to fully know what a user knows. And if we make an assumption, that could totally be a blocker for them in their experience. So as an example, if your team designs an accounting software, that's a product that you build, don't assume they know what a general ledger is. The reason being, right, your main user audience might be accountants, but if you just say, put something in the general ledger, that's not going to help the executive assistant who is covering for the accountant, because the accountant is in the Bahamas for 2 weeks. Because the executive assistant doesn't know what the general ledger is. They were just asked to put amounts into your app. So if there's an area where you're like, I wonder if the user will know this terminology, or they'll know what we're inferring to. If you ever have doubts on that, the best way that I've found is add a link, right? Make a connection with your documentation or with another resource that explains things. Just never assume users know what you're talking about. Instead, build these great content experiences to help them move through situations where they might not know what's going on. This is super hard. Your support team will be able to help you build more of these. So we've seen how we write like matters a lot, and we have to focus on really small details. Let's look at how we can expand this information experience further by connecting with the marketing team. I used to be kind of anti-marketing. I think that's very similar to a lot of tech writers I've talked to, because there's this feeling that all they write is fluff and it's semi-inaccurate. And yes, that is true sometimes, but I found a lot of marketers are truly trying to help connect users to solutions. That's their whole job. And that's very hard to do these days. There's a lot of competition in every market. It's hard to make your product known. And most importantly, the solutions that your product offers. So I encourage you to connect with your marketing team to see what they're trying to do. They work in campaigns, so they look at 3 months of work or 1 month of information to try to message something out into the universe. See how you can align what they're looking to do with what you're working on. So in Dan's example in his talk, the marketing team is trying to push Git and how Atlassian tools can help you with Git. And Dan said, oh, well, that's great. We have Git tutorials, and the tool team for GitHub, or not GitHub, what's their Git tool? Whatever Atlassian's Git tool is, they all work together to help introduce people to Git, get them to a microsite about Git, help them quickly move into product tutorials, and then move right into the product. And the effects were just amazing. So align with marketing and share those user flows that you understand, the things that you've gotten from your designers, and you sort of understand users' intentions, what they really want to do. Often marketing people don't know that full journey and what users can accomplish. And in the same respect, marketers know where users are coming from far beyond or before user designers start to think about things. Marketing knows, where do these people come from? What are their ultimate struggles? What are they looking to do? That can further expand your empathy and your ability to write to those people who are coming from nowhere, all of a sudden using your app. And if you can collaborate with these folks, try to do writing together. Marketing people are really great at talking about solutions. I'm not. I focus on features. I love all the little switches and knobs. Marketing people are much better at focusing on the big picture, the why. And then also we can be there to help fact check marketing, supply great documentation to marketing, because they are just trying to create content as fast as they possibly can. And as it turns out, we are sitting on a great big pile of it. So we've talked about a lot of things here, right? We've talked about why it matters that we create these rich content experiences for our users. And we've figured out where we need to start, what it is we need to work on, and who exactly we need to get to know so we can work with them. We've talked a lot about working with our designers and how they understand the user journeys, how we can sort of jump onto that and begin to know our users better. And then we can map out content experiences for our apps. And we've talked about aligning with documentation teams and structuring our content for reuse so that we can connect our documentation with in-app help, with links to our help, with UI text, all those things that our team wants to do with content. We've talked about why we need to focus even more on voice and tone, how it becomes critical when users can really get to content quickly, that it all is saying the right things, just enough of those things, and it's not assuming that they know things that they don't know. And then we talked about how we can extend the effectiveness of all of this by aligning with our marketing team to expand the information experience for our users. Because at the end of the day, our users do not care who created the information they're looking at. They're just looking at it. They don't care who sent the email. They don't care who wrote the help center. They're just experiencing this all at the same time. And so the better we can do to take our content, remove those borders, and create these intelligent connections to really help our users be successful, well, the more successful our users will be, the more successful our team will be, and the more successful our organizations will be as a whole. So without further ado, I would love to talk more about this, to get your questions. So let's look at your questions. I'm going to open up the chat. All right, let's see. So I see nerd alert. That is totally somebody talking about me. No, that's from earlier. Yeah, so the cooking theme was not intentional. I didn't align with anybody, but yeah, it's been amazing. And honestly, that was the best example I could come up with for what we have here, because it's just not a very concrete thing. Like I'm not telling you go and do the thing we did. I'm just saying, here's maybe a different way to think about it. Here's how we put stuff together. I would encourage you. I'm not an Alton Brown. I'm not telling you, how to cook the steak perfectly. I'm the person who had everything pre-measured. I'm just dumping in and smiling, so to speak. I like to believe that I'm involving the rest of the team in writing my documentation. I hope you do. I hope you are. The biggest thing that I found is like helping open my team's eyes to the value of content and to a user. We actually did something recently where we created really great demo content for our app. So like, when you go to take a screenshot and you have this like version of your app set up with like cat pictures and lorem ipsum, and it just doesn't really make sense, but it looks okay enough to get a screenshot. When our users come across those, it's just like, what is going on here? Like, yeah, it's funny, I guess, that there's cats, but I don't know if this really solves the problem I have. I have a thing I care about. Does this product really solve that? Do they even care that I have this problem? And so when you start to expose things like that to the whole team, it's amazing how people will be shocked. You know, when you tell an engineer, no, don't log into our app as an admin, log in as a standard user. Does this experience, you know, do you have all the abilities you actually need to? Those sorts of thoughtful things, we really have to push ourselves to do, and to rethink every error message, every document, every link, you know, every problem our users have, and see, are we providing the best solution, the best experience for them we possibly can? Let's see. To write the intros in my topics, I use the description and acceptance criteria from our user stories. That's so good. Yeah, there's we actually have a microsite called Rock the Docs that I got to write at K15T, and we have a whole section on agile documentation. And yeah, that is such a good hack. We actually cover that there, how to take your epics, user stories, acceptance criteria, and to hack them right into your topics. It makes it so much faster to like get into those and get going. And honestly, that starts to help you all think about what are users' real problems. That is so cool. We use an app for our SaaS product called WalkMe. Very cool. It figures out what the user is doing and provides help. Yeah, WalkMe is very, very cool. I've seen a few things like WalkMe. I tried to use WalkMe at my last company. It was too expensive for our team. We were making a Salesforce app. It seemed really cool, but now there's a lot of great options out there. Someone has used Scroll PDF Exporter. Awesome. My team, that's a pretty cool one that we make. Yeah. And it's fun to like make stuff in Confluence, but then your users are like, yeah, but I need a help center, or I need a PDF. I don't want to look at Confluence. And so that's where our apps come in. Jamie likes cats. You know, if generally your work problems relate to cats, then I guess that's the way, solutions should be marketed for a product. By the way, I like cats. I should have everyone know I'm not anti-cat. I can't stand it when screenshots don't reflect what users would see. That's me. That's like totally where I am. So actually, I'm preparing another talk all about this user data that we made. We got to spend so much time. We've really tried to focus on making it inclusive. So like coming up with example users that like really make sense to our user base, which is super challenging and humbling. But then also like thinking about every use case for how our app can be used, and having that all pre-set up so that it's actually had a huge impact across the company. Everyone uses this data for different things. I could go on for another 50 minutes about that. Hopefully I will get to do that sometime. How do you feel about the modularity of structured documents or authoring, excuse me? Does it help you with content reuse? That's a really good question. I think it does help. The problem is, and I don't remember who talked about this, so I can't give credit where credit's due, but when you structure your content a lot, and I used to work with a data tool, so we were doing that really, really heavily. It's very cool what you can build, but it's kind of like, it's the difference between data and information. You know, at some point when you've broken your content up so much, you just have little bits of information, sometimes like tiny or data, I should say, tiny bits of data, and you really have to assemble it well to make it truly meaningful. So if you get too modular with your documentation, for example, like you're breaking every task topic out into its own page when they're looking at it, that makes it very hard to have those in context with what they're trying to do, maybe. So too much modularity can make the experience very jagged and rough. But then also, if you really know what users want to do, then you can assemble all those little chunks really, really nicely to make true meaning. So I would say, yes, really structured content is great if you put it together in a great way, bringing it into your UI or connecting it in some way for users so that you really are thinking about their purpose for wanting to do all those things that they truly care about. Okay. we do have agreement that the screenshots should be truly reflective of what our users need. But if you're creating an app for people with pets, that would be so cool. That would be so awesome. I've had mixed experience with short descriptions. Sometimes they seem to belabor the obvious. Is this just the confusion of short descriptions? That's a good point. So a short description, in my mind, I've seen them used so many different ways, and even within my team, and sometimes it bugs me, and sometimes I'm like, am I wrong? So sometimes I see them like, on this page, you will learn blah, 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 and blah, and you'll be able to do blah by the end of it. That kind of bothers me just because it makes some assumptions, like it says it's a page, but what if someday we want to reuse the content in another way, like in an in-app help window? Then that doesn't make any sense. And then also it's like, I don't know, it seems very repetitive. Also, it assumes that people are reading something linearly, which they might not be. I like to write them more like just sort of introducing the why. So I like to say, like, if you're trying to enter things into the company's general ledger, you'll probably want to insert individual expenditures. Wow, I really know accounting talk. Here's how you do that. So something like that, but that can feel repetitive as well. Short descriptions are really hard, right? Sometimes the title of the page really describes it well. What I try to do with them is just make sure that if I saw the thing standing alone, like with a link to the page, I could read that short description and be like, oh yeah, I know what this page is about if I click the link. For some systems, you can write the short description and then hide it from users. So if you're finding they're really just super repetitive, maybe do that. Anybody else chime in there? Because yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with them, or a frenemies, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, okay, so another person having trouble with short descriptions. Yeah, it seems like the title gives you that information, especially with task topics. So true, so true. And a coworker challenged me a few years back by saying, hey, like if you're using the same words in the title that you are in the description, you're not writing a proper description. A proper description should have different wording to it. That's a challenge, but I do still think they're valuable in a lot of situations. Short description is great as a tooltip, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with Jennifer. I do think short descriptions are the hardest to write. Very often, that's the last thing I write on a page. Trying to summarize what you're going to write before you write it is awful. So in Confluence, you write your short descriptions in a macro called the excerpt macro. So you put that right at the top. I just dump that macro on the page and I leave it blank until I'm done writing my thing. And then I'll come back and summarize what I've written. Yeah, so Robert mentions that he requires a description within all of his API documentation for every topic, call, parameter. I think it's super important. Actually, our team is updating our API documentation right now, and I heard someone say like, "Oh, well, I don't need a description on this. It's self-explanatory." And I was like, "Got to have a description. That needs to be there." All right. Well, some amazing conversation here and questions. I won't just keep reading the chat out loud to everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I did mention Rock the Docs earlier. If you're curious how to do tech writing in Confluence, I didn't think it was possible a few years back, and now I'm pretty into it. This guide is there to sort of show how to do it with or without our apps. There's a lot of techniques you can do with just vanilla Confluence, but a lot of tips on how to just structure it, even if your internal organization is using it. Check that out. It's really, really helpful for like, what are the tools and techniques that even Atlassian is using within Confluence. So highly recommend it. If you come back on May 10th, we're going to be totally redesigning it and starting to pour new content and videos into it. I'm really, really excited about that. But thanks a lot, everybody. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much,